Right. So welcome again from my side to this, I think, 6th or 7th installment of Encounters already, where we try to provide these multiple perspectives on China-US relations, considering different Chinese voices from the mainland. We had Taiwan and Hong Kong recently, but then also different types of voices from the US. We've had Chinese voices from the US as well, contrasting American perspectives from politics, from economy and the arts, and doing this in a sort of multipolar way, which today we do by having invited Fiona Hill, who will now be introduced by Werner, my colleague from the Heidelberg Center of American Studies. Welcome again, and have a good meeting.
Well, thank you, Barbara. Good evening and welcome once again to Encounters. Barbara Mittler already introduced me. My name is Werner. I am the director of the Heidelberg Center for American Studies. And it is my great pleasure to introduce the participants of tonight's event. I am very excited to welcome Dr. Fiona Hill to our Zoom conversation. She is joining us from Munich tonight. As many of you know, Fiona Hill serves currently as Senior Fellow at the Brookings Institution in Washington, D.C., more specifically at the Center on the United States and Europe. She is considered one of America's most clear-eyed observers of Russia and its President, Vladimir Putin. She holds a master's degree in Russian and modern history from St. Andrews University in Scotland, pursued studies at Moscow's Maurice Thorez Institute of Foreign Languages, and holds a master's in Soviet studies as well as a doctorate in history from Harvard University. Fiona Hill has served 3 American presidents from 2006 to 2009 as National Intelligence Officer for Russia and Eurasia at the National Intelligence Council, and from 2017 to 2019 as Deputy Assistant and Senior Director for European and Russian Affairs on the National Security Council. Prior to joining Brookings, Dr. Hill was Director of Strategic Planning at the Eurasia Foundation in Washington, D.C., and held a number of positions directing technical assistance and research project at Harvard University's John F. Kennedy School of Government. Fiona Hill has researched and published extensively on issues related to Russia, Central Asia, regional conflicts, energy, and international strategic policy issues. I would like to draw your attention to just 2 of her publications: Mr. Putin, Operative in the Kremlin, with Gary Clifford, published in 2015, and her recent memoir, published last year, There is Nothing for You Here, Finding Opportunity in the 21st Century, a great read. Dr. Hill, welcome to Encounters.
Oh, thank you so much, Val. Really great to be with you and Barbara and Martin and everyone. Thank you.
Joining Fiona Hill on our virtual stage is my colleague Martin Thunert, who is the Senior Lecturer in Political Science here at Heidelberg University's Heidelberg Center for American Studies. He holds a doctoral degree from Augsburg University and received his Habilitation in Political Science from the Universität Hamburg. Before coming to the HCA, Dr. Thunert held a number of positions at German and North American universities, among them the Universität Hamburg and the University of Michigan at Ann Arbor. His teaching and research focus on comparative politics, think tanks, and on Politikberatung, or in other words, political consulting. Among his many publications is the volume Entzauberung, Skizzen und Ansichten zu den USA in der Ära Obama with Tobias Endler, published in 2015. Martin Thunert frequently comments on North American politics in German language media and is a regular guest on the HCA podcast Quo Vadis USA. Welcome, Martin.
Thank you very much for this kind introduction, and I'm very excited to be, and it's a real honor and privilege now to have a conversation with someone I'm aware of for many, many years, read a lot about Fiona, by Fiona, and probably at some point, whenever I'm in Washington, I often go to a Brookings event, we have been sitting physically in the same room, maybe once or twice. And I think I was even in Tübingen as a very young undergraduate student. I'm a bit older than her when she was an exchange student there. So probably we met somewhere in Tübingen in the downtown, not knowing.
Yeah.
We were very, very young. So
I was probably one of those noisy British kids who was, annoying everyone.
Yeah.
Well, we are looking forward to your thoughts on rivals or enemies, the United States, Russia, and China. Please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. So, and welcome everyone at home or where you are on the screens. And before we tackle the big world issues of these three countries and this triangular relationship, I would like to start with one sort of biographical, career-oriented question, which I took from the book and also from a similar event where Fiona told the audience quite a bit about the book and about her career. That I think is maybe not just interesting to someone like me who studies policy advice mechanisms, but also maybe to some of our younger viewers who still have to make career choices. So in the book, you said that when you were a young woman or even girl in the northeast of England, you had a talent for languages and you wanted to work in international affairs. And you said in the book and also yesterday that you thought you might become an interpreter at United Nations or perhaps a diplomat. And then you spent a decade at one of the world's best universities. I count St. Andrews with that, but also Harvard, of course. And then you entered the track of a policy expert on Russia, and both, as Fiona has said in the intro, in expert-based governmental units like the National Security Council, but also in the think tank and foundation world. And my question would be, was this a conscious decision to leave academia? Was it more by accident? And what role did mentors, and especially female mentors, play in that decision? And did you ever have second thoughts about making this career change?
Well, thank you very much, Martin. And, I appreciate you raising that question, especially as I'm sure, as you said, that it might be very interesting to some of the students at Heidelberg and elsewhere who might be listening to this. Very early on, even when I was a child in school, I also mentioned this in the book, that my local member of parliament came to speak to the school. And he had come from a similar poor working class background. He'd basically got success through education. At one point, he'd even been the head of the local education authority in the north of England. And he'd actually came to my school and actually told myself and other students, we were probably maybe 14, 15, maybe 16 years old, that education was a privilege, and that if you managed to get an education, then you should do something with it. So from a very early age, I was always thinking that it wasn't education for education's sake, that education was a tool, but it was, as I said, this idea of being a privilege, and that I also should do something with education. So as I was moving along through university, both my undergraduate at St. Andrews and elsewhere, I was always thinking about, was there something practical that I could do with the education? I wanted to learn as much as I possibly can. But as you said, I also, because of the moment in time, and we're in another one of those moments now, there was so much happening in the broader world that I wanted to find a way of applying the knowledge that I was learning to practical things. And I think, in part, that might be because of my upbringing. My father was a coal miner. All of my male relatives were coal miners and worked in factories. They made things, they did things, as well as extracted things in the case of coal. My mother was a nurse, a midwife, and she decided to help women survive childbirth. As I grew up, I only have one child, partly because of listening to my mother talking about how dangerous childbirth was, because her profession was, trying to make it easier. And even then, she was trying to think about, how did she help people? How did she apply her knowledge in a concrete setting? So in part, that was something that shaped me. I didn't feel like I wanted to be an academic that really was focused in academia itself, just writing books and hoping that maybe somebody else might pay attention to things I was writing about, that I thought myself, well, how can I do something in that larger context? That gave me the framework. And what happened really that put me on the course was when I was working on my PhD at Harvard, I started to work at the Kennedy School of Government with Professor Graham Allison, who has become famous once again because of the current discussions about the nuclear threat from Vladimir Putin, and all the talk now about a return to the Cuban Missile Crisis and the Euro Missile Crisis. And of course, Professor Graham Allison became very famous for a book that he wrote called Essence of Decision about the Cuban Missile Crisis. And I'm sure that many of your students who are studying the United States and politics and national security are familiar with this book. It was at one point the best-selling book on political science in the United States. And working with Professor Allison gave me a lot of insight into how policy was made and politics. It was the Kennedy School of Government, very much focused on policy. I became more involved there in interactions and discussions about the application of knowledge to policy. I met a lot of former policymakers. And so it gave me a kind of a sense that there was an opportunity out there to do something other than going on an academic track and becoming a professor or a lecturer at university. And I became heavily involved in technical assistance projects that were then going on at the Kennedy School of Government in relationship to the changes and transformations happening in Russia, Ukraine, Central Asia, the Caucasus, the former Soviet Union in the 1990s after the collapse of the Soviet Union. That led to a job, as Wilf was reading out my resume, with the Eurasia Foundation in Washington, D.C., working on technical assistance. And at that point, I thought I would try that out and then maybe, think about going back to academia. But it gave me also an opportunity then, as I became affiliated with the Brookings Institution, that I still am affiliated with, to see that you could combine a job with an academic and policy focus with, something more practical as well. And it was working with the Brookings Institution that I got the opportunities to serve in government, because Brookings has the capacity to lend people out to the United States government, as some other institutions do as well. People have heard of RAND, of course, and you've studied all of this, Martin. I mean, you know all about these institutions in Washington, D.C. that have a kind of a portal, as it were, a door into government. And people, sometimes they call it the revolving door, because people go in and go out. But in both of the instances in which I worked in government, I was lent out by Brookings to the government. Now, the second time with the Trump administration, obviously that was really controversial. So I actually took a leave from Brookings, but on the understanding that I could go back again. In the first instance with the National Intelligence Council, Brookings loaned me out, and Brookings actually got compensated for me working for the government in a purely almost academic analytical position, bringing together all the intelligence, which is really all of the analysis about Russia and the former Soviet Union. So that's how that happened. But I think even in the German context, there are opportunities for people to play, a different role. If you think about think tanks, I do a lot of work with the DGAP. I'm going to spend some time next year with the Robert Bosch Stiftung. There's Aspen group, for example, that operates in Germany. There are many, obviously, institutes like in Heidelberg with the Center for American Studies that give people an experience of something else, the work that you have done, Martin, the experiences that you have had. I think that there are many opportunities for younger people now to think about a professional perspective, a position that would give them some ability to be able to have an influence on policy as well, and perhaps also go into government.
Well, thanks very much. And now let's dive right into the big issues. Just a week ago, almost to the day, Biden administration published its new national security strategy. And it has, of course, a chapter on China and Russia. And the headline there is Outcompeting China and Constraining Russia. So my question is, what do these terms mean? And does the US see China and Russia posing a common challenge to the United States and the West? or do both pose distinct challenges to us? What is your opinion on that? I know there's an opinion in the national security. Perhaps you have, but perhaps you have a different opinion or the same. So, what is your take on these things?
Well, first of all, national security strategies are quite an unusual thing. I know in Germany, actually, there's an attempt right now to create a national security strategy, but you've had plenty of other white papers, Weißbuche, that have been done for the Ministry of Defense, for example, and sometimes for foreign policy. But there is an exercise now in Germany, I think for the first time, right, in terms of putting a comprehensive national security strategy in place. But in the United States, they seem to happen very frequently. Every time an administration comes in, they put together a national security strategy as if there's some massive change in national security with each administration, which of course there isn't. So I think you will also find, if you look very closely, that there is continuity, even with the previous national security strategy of Donald Trump or previous national security strategies that were put out under Barack Obama and going further back, for example, because there is a lot of continuity as well as some change in national security affairs. And that then leads me, to some of the observations about China and Russia. I mean, obviously, I was at the National Security Council when the Trump administration, it wasn't Trump himself, obviously, but the National Security Advisor at the time, this was General H.R. McMaster, who then wrote a book called Battlegrounds, which is really his thinking that went into the national security strategy. So if anyone's interested in that, they can read his book. But I was there when he was thinking about this. And I think in that national security strategy, there was more of a conflation of Russia and China as a challenge that I and others at the time didn't actually really agree with. Because I think they are, and this has come out, I think, very clearly in this national security strategy, some real distinct challenges that Russia and China separately pose. But of course, there is a common challenge that we see. So in terms of the distinct challenges, and I think this is quite well laid out in this national security strategy, China obviously has system potential. In other words, it could create its own international system, whereas Russia we see is much more of a destructive entity. Russia is really trying to blow up the international order. I'm not necessarily trying to create a new one, but in China's case, there is obviously an intent to create a different China-centric, China-dominated national security order. And we see that quite clearly. Now, in terms of the common challenge, we also see that at this particular juncture. It was perhaps less evident back in 2017 or 2018, but because of the decision by President Xi and his meeting with Putin on the margins of the Beijing Winter Olympics, back in just a week or so, 2 weeks before the intervention, the invasion of Ukraine by Russia, we actually see Russia and China coming very distinctly together in a way that perhaps was unfolding previously, but now has really coalesced. So this discussion of a limitless partnership, the fact that President Xi was very critical about NATO and NATO expansion, which was something, of a surprise, I think, for many people, although at the same time, NATO was itself trying to formulate a China policy, a kind of national security strategy towards China as well for NATO. But at the same time, this is the first time that China had been quite so outspoken about NATO and about European security issues. Now, if we move forward from that point, I think we have some questions now, and that's probably part of the backdrop to the writing of the national security strategy, about how far China and Russia will go together. And I'm sure we're going to talk about this a little more. I don't want to make this too long an answer. But I think there's now some hesitation on the part of China, even about the relationship with Russia in some respects, because China didn't expect the invasion of Ukraine to take the form that it has now of a full-blown war that has ended up with, now as we're just talking today, efforts to, completely destroy Ukrainians' infrastructure, as well as the annexations of all of this territory by Russia. I think China thought something else was going to happen there. And, instead, we've had a war that is changing the whole international dynamic. And I think that I've just recently given quite a few interviews where I've even said that, look, this war in Ukraine is almost a third world war, because it's a war over territory, just like we had in World War I and World War II. It's having global ramifications in terms of the impacts on energy and food security, not just in Europe, but globally. And it's a war that is changing the international order. And China wanted to change that international order on its terms. But here we have Russia upending the entire international order and leaving it in tatters. We have Vladimir Putin threatening nuclear war in the sense of using a nuclear weapon to reverse the situation on the battlefield in Ukraine, which is not something that China would have liked to see. And as a result is upsetting the whole international security balance surrounded around nuclear weapons and nuclear stability as well. Because there's been no change in the weapons systems in the United States. This isn't like the Euro missile crisis of the 1980s or like the Cuban Missile Crisis of the 1960s. This is something different, very much focused on the battlefield and the battlefield tactics of Russia. And so the question, I think, really is now, looking ahead, is about how China will also manage this relationship with Russia. From our perspective, it does seem like there is a common threat based on this limitless partnership, but at the same time, there are very distinct problems here. There is a relationship, obviously, between how China sees Taiwan, and with the Party Congress, of course, I think we have a lot of worry and concern now that China has not ruled out using force to retake Taiwan and bring Taiwan fully back into China. But, you know, the relationship between Taiwan and China and Ukraine and Russia is also very different. But clearly China is watching what happens with Russia with this war. And in some respects, as I said, China and China's relationship to Russia now will be very determinative moving forward in what happens next in this conflict. But I think, you know, for the national security strategy, they have a problem because, I mean, they're writing about a situation that is evolving very fast. And I think that, you know, you can't capture everything in that document. They're right that China has the biggest systemic threat, but there's a lot of things that could happen in the course of this war that could change all of those sets of interactions between Russia and China itself, but more broadly with China and the rest of the world, as well as Russia.
Yeah, thank you. So if I summarize what you said and what's in the strategy, am I correct to say that from the US perspective, China is mostly, at this moment at least, a geo-economic threat, a global one, but militarily or security-wise more of a regional threat in the Indo-Pacific or Asia-Pacific, whereas Russia is mainly a military a threat, and a very proximate military threat, and which has intensified because of the war against the so-called special military operation against Ukraine. So clearly distinct threats that should not be lumped together too much. Is that the correct reading of what you said?
Yes, but I agree completely, Martin. I mean, you've put it very succinctly, so thank you, because I gave a very long answer there. So I appreciate the way that you pulled that together. But I do think that China and Russia have both become then a threat in the European security arena as well, together. You know, perhaps more so than for the United States, because China really, in many respects, facilitated Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And China's commentary was really about NATO. Now, I think it was partly because China was worried that NATO-like mechanisms would be set up in the Asia-Pacific. That really there would be, and because of Japan and South Korea and other countries cooperating more with NATO, that there might be an extension of that mechanism into the Asia-Pacific region as well. But so I think, you know, for the first time in making that statement, that joint statement with Russia, President Xi made China a security factor in Europe as well. Now, I think that that's kind of changing. Maybe China's pulling back because of what's happening on the ground in Ukraine, but we'll just have to see.
And now changing the perspective, so we often talk about the vulnerability of the West, of the United States, obviously of its allies like Ukraine, but which of the two other countries, Russia and China, do you think is more vulnerable to what the West is doing? Who feels more cornered or threatened by what they say or what the West or the United States leadership is actually doing. Would that be Russia or China, or both at this to the same degree?
Well, I think both, actually, which is why that we have seen them banding together. I mean, obviously for different sets of reasons. I mean, again, as Ukraine and Taiwan, and there's some structural similarity to this, that Russia makes claims on Ukraine in a similar manner to which China makes claims on Taiwan, but we've never recognized the full independence of Taiwan, where for 30 years there's been full recognition of Ukraine's independence, territorial integrity, and sovereignty. And in fact, the United States and the United Kingdom made a commitment, along with Russia, to uphold Ukraine's territorial integrity and sovereignty and independence in 1994. And we haven't made those. Well, there are commitments towards Taiwan, but they're somewhat different. But the larger issue, in terms of how Russia perceives things and threats from the West, I mean, it's coming right now in the war in Ukraine. Russia's goals of dismembering Ukraine, of basically making Ukraine a kind of a proxy country, are being thwarted by Western support, US and other European support for Ukraine and its efforts to repel Russia's invasion. So right now we are in the midst of Russia feeling, especially threatened, which is why Russia and Putin are threatening the use of a nuclear weapon, because they want to change the whole framing. They want to have a negotiation that puts Ukraine to one side with the United States, as they did have, they're making this quite explicit, during the Cuban Missile Crisis. But instead of moving missiles from Turkey or Cuba, they want us to hand over Ukraine. They want the United States and NATO countries to take themselves out of support for Ukraine in the war. Now, China, I think, feels generally threatened at the moment about, the United States protection for Taiwan as a quasi independent country, but not officially, but for Taiwan having a separate political ability. One always has to be very careful about how one describes this in that kind of context, and the US has been quite forthright about that. But China also feels that the United States constrains its ability to exert itself in the Asia-Pacific region. Doesn't like the fact that the United States now calls this the Indo-Pacific region, to kind of exclude China as the dominant power. And, China's ambitions aren't just regional, though. I mean, they are more global. China's investment in Latin and South America, in Africa, for example, elsewhere in Asia, it feels, with the Belt and Road Initiative, and in Europe and elsewhere, that the United States is constraining, or has up until the COVID pandemic, which has constrained that for China anyway, that the United States was constraining its ability to really exert more, as you put it, geo-economic power. So the United States is as a constraint, as an impediment to China, fulfilling all of its economic and geopolitical ambitions. Russia, I think, part of the mistake that the Obama administration, when Russia annexed Crimea, was to call Russia a regional power, because at various points Putin and others have also expressed global ambitions. I mean, in many respects, Russia wants to be taken seriously still as a global power, a superpower, in the way that it was before the collapse of the Soviet Union. It wants to be able to be there competing with China in places, but obviously can't in the same way. And so Russia's tended to take more, as you pointed out, military action. And if it can't be present in a country economically, it can't have the kind of influence and power that China has. It wants to be a security player, even if that means on a smaller scale, using paramilitaries, like we've seen in Mali and elsewhere in Africa, for example, or propping up governments in places like Venezuela with Nicolás Maduro, by sending in small contingents of specialists to help them out and stay in power. So Russia wants to play a larger game, but can't play it obviously in the same way that China can. And I think that also Russia sees China as kind of a mechanism and a vehicle for having more influence by bandwagoning, as we call it, with China, that Russia then can play on a larger stage. I think the problem for Russia, which is not really quite the question you asked, but the problem for Russia is that Russia is now most clearly in a vulnerable position, and most definitely a secondary power vis-a-vis China. in terms of regional affairs, and even more so now because of the disaster of the war. Even if Russia is sending kamikaze drones and missiles over Ukraine and ruining Ukraine, it's very obvious that Russia's own military has failed to get traction, and has not succeeded at all in any of the goals that it set out to do in February when it invaded.
Yeah, before I come back to the China-Russia relationship, I just want to bring in some of the American critics of the strategy that the Biden administration and probably NATO have. I was at a conference recently, American Political Science Association, and two more academics, John Mearsheimer and Stephen Walt, discussed Ukraine and this whole situation. And Walt's argument in particular was that NATO's open door policy for new members has been a mistake from the get-go. Shouldn't have happened. And Mearsheimer, and this was a very civilized discussion, unlike similar discussion we have on German TV on this issue, he said, for Vladimir Putin, a successful Ukraine, because the people that the country is so similar, that is pluralistic, has a democratic, liberal, rules-based democracy, rule of law, perhaps judicial review, where people in the LGBT community could live freely, et cetera, a successful Ukraine so close to Russia. It's not mainly about NATO membership or not, but if it's as a society would have so much soft power that it's an existential threat for Vladimir Putin. And because he sees it that way, and he's not the only one who sees it that way in Russia, he has really no room to negotiate. He has to destroy it. And so he will go to the ultimate thing. And therefore, it was a mistake not to respect that more. And how do you respond to these allegations that it started all with the open door policy of NATO, that whoever wants to join could theoretically get an invitation?
I don't disagree that the decision in 2008 to create the open door for Georgia and Ukraine was a mistake. I've said myself that I thought it was a blunder, and I was actually in the National Intelligence Council at the time, and we advised against it for many reasons that's laid out there, because of the inevitable reaction of Russia to this, and the fact that we actually foresaw that there would be military action taken against Georgia and Ukraine if they were pursuing NATO membership, and that should have been thought of and should have been considered. But I would disagree that NATO was the start of everything, or is the reason, the impetus for the Russian invasion. Very carefully, Putin himself said in September 30th, when he annexed the territories of Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporizhia, and Kherson, he hardly ever mentioned NATO. In fact, I don't think he really did. It's not a central theme. His focus was all on the territorial restoration of the Russian world and of territories that Russia feels it's lost, and he personally feels it's lost, that were taken first by Catherine the Great in the 1780s. So it's very much a historic perspective, an imperial perspective of retaking territory. And if you go back to the early 1990s, I can point people to a report that I wrote when I was a graduate student with a colleague called Back in the USSR, which was written in 1993 and published in early 1994. And it's on the Belfer Center at the Kennedy School's website, so people can go back and look at this. We actually predicted something like this, because there was already, after the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1992, so before there was any discussion of expansion of NATO, well before that, a lot of hardliners and nationalists in Russia wanted the territories back again, particularly all of the Russian-speaking territories. In other words, not really the territories, but territories in which Russian speakers found themselves after the collapse of the Soviet Union. You'll remember this, Martin, and Velf and Barbara and Anya might remember it as well, because we're of that age, that there were, many discussions about what to happen with Russians in the near abroad, Russian speakers. Even if those Russian speakers didn't identify themselves necessarily as Russian, they might actually think that they were Ukrainian, because I'm English, and so many people speak English around the world. They're not all English. The Scottish independence movement, for example, is predicated on a different set of identity, but not on the Scottish language, just to be clear. Australia, Canada, New Zealand, America basically pulled away from the United Kingdom and the British monarchy, even though everyone was speaking English in the German as well, obviously at that time, but also English at that period of the American Revolution. So we know that language isn't of itself sufficient for a separate identity. But in the 1990s, early 1990s, there was already this movement to take back Russian speakers. That was under Boris Yeltsin. And there were many people pushing this who are now in the circles around Vladimir Putin, because he's of that age group. And the agreements by the United Kingdom, the United States and Russia to protect Ukraine's territorial integrity came out of a lot of pressure and tension in that very period of 1993, 1994, recognizing that Ukraine was under a lot of pressure from Russian nationalists. And all the way along, if you watch this very closely, as I have been doing since the very 1990s, you can see that tension, that pressure was always there. And of course, it was increased by the efforts of Ukraine and Georgia, later to join NATO, but it preceded the whole idea of NATO expansion. It came well before this. So there was always this kind of post-imperial anxiety, this loss of territory that came even before that for many Russians. And I wrote my dissertation back in the 1990s about the obsession with many Russian nationalists about being a great power still. And again, this had very little to do with NATO itself. NATO became an affront. It was something that there was a lot of opposition to, but it's in that larger context of believing that these countries, what Mearsheimer himself actually said there, that these countries should not have any separate identity from Russia. And then, as you point out, the political changes inside of Ukraine, the more pluralistic politics, the kind of sense that there was more of a Ukrainian democracy, even if it was very messy, was also seen as a real threat to Putin, who was creating not just a vertical of power, but more of an authoritarian system. Ukraine's had many changes of government. Some of them been, through elections, some of them have been through protests, but there's been many changes of government in Ukraine since the 1990s, just as there has in Moldova and, some other countries as well. And that's been seen, by someone like Vladimir Putin, who's promising to be in power till 2036, as something that's also a threat. So it's not simple enough to say that it's about NATO. It, of course, plays a role, but we have to go really far back to the collapse of the Soviet Union and also to the creation of the Commonwealth of Independent States, because many of the people around Putin who helped with the creation of that Commonwealth of Independent States, there were people in Putin's team who took part in all of the thinking about that from the legal perspective. They wanted to ensure that Ukraine would always be close. Ukraine would never have the opportunity to go somewhere else, but Ukraine's always been trying to break away.
Yeah, I mean, this is a very serious topic, but I couldn't help when you told the title of this paper back in the USSR, that even the Beatles in the song of the same name differentiate between the Russian and the Ukrainian girls, knock me out and leave the West behind. Yeah, so so Paul McCartney was quite farsighted in that. Yeah, but
yes, he must have been. In fact, that's actually why we picked the title, obviously, because we were younger scholars. We thought that was cool because we remembered that as well.
But back to China and Russia. How does Russia look at Chinese initiatives, and you could also say how the Americans are viewing this, like the Belt and Road Initiative, or sometimes as we call it in Germany, the New Silk Road Initiative. How is this perceived in Russia? Do Russians care about this, or do they think it's irrelevant because it also goes through many former Soviet republics? And will the division of labor that you described between Russia and China be such that Russia will become, because it's not going to sell its natural gas, not even to countries like Germany in the foreseeable future, that it becomes sort of the number one supplier of fossil fuels, or is China so far advanced with renewable energy, solar, that this is not relevant, and that it's very clear that in any respect, Russia will be the junior partner in that relationship, and that will not make Russians too happy that they are a junior partner in the relationship?
Yeah, I think this is a great question, Martin. I think there's a lot of complexity in the Russian-Chinese relationship. I myself, much earlier on, was more on the side that Russia and China wouldn't pull together because of all of this complexity. But I discounted, mistakenly, the push factor that the United States policy was having. I think we and the United States really pushed China and Russia closer together, by many policies as well. There's a shared interest on the part of Russia and China to push back against the United States that really, needed to be factored in. Then there's also, I think, on the part of Russia, a real desire to be closer to China because of China being the real rising power. And just like China thinks the United States is in decline, the Russia was convinced the United States was in decline and the future was with China, and hoping to be able to cash in many respects on the economic rise of China. That's before COVID. China and Russia was hoping that there would be a division of labor, in fact, that China's economic power would predominate in Central Asia and other regions, while Russia would continue to be the security provider. I think, where the anxiety came in was about the rise of the Chinese military. And of course, Russia was a major seller of weapons and equipment and other sophisticated systems to China, which China has reverse engineered. So there has been in the past a lot of anxiety in the Russian military about, the kind of future relationship with China. And part of that is because of Russia's own territorial acquisitions against China's expense in the 19th century. I think, Putin's very carefully trying to word everything all the time about the invasions of Ukraine and, talking about, the colonialism of the United States and the West always trying to oppress Russia, etc. Russia trying to present itself as it was in the Soviet period as the leader of post-colonial liberation. But Russia was an imperial power in Europe in the 19th century among the same powers that predated on China. There are huge squares of Russian territory that were taken from China in the 1860s, at the same time that Putin keeps talking about the Opium Wars and what the Europeans did, but Russia's a European colonial power. Russia did exactly the same thing. And so Putin is always trying to divert Chinese attention away from this. And again, one of the reasons why I was skeptical about the Russian-Chinese relationship was when I made a trip to China quite some time ago, and I went to visit some Chinese academics who look at Russia and Europe and the former Soviet Union. I was struck by the maps on their walls behind them that very clearly show Chinese claims on Russian territory. So, we think back to the 2000s when Boris Yeltsin, prior to the 2000 and when Putin came in, but under Yeltsin and then under Putin, Boris Yeltsin and other regional leaders were very nervous about the border with China after the collapse of the Soviet Union and wanting to make sure that there was no, further disputes on that long border because there were so much territory had changed hands in different points in different centuries. And so, we know that the Shanghai Cooperation Organization was set up specifically to manage the relationship and manage those borders, that long border extending from Central Asia and Russia with China. Shanghai Cooperation Organization wasn't a Warsaw Pact or a NATO. It was all about how to manage a potentially difficult relationship with China. So there's a lot of questions still in that relationship over the longer term. And I think, that the Russians are really hoping that, they'll come out of this war with hand. Because Russia looks, if it loses in Ukraine, gets back actually to something else that you said that Meisham said, Russia will be weaker vis-a-vis China territorially as well, not just because Putin has really laid into question the entire borders, post-Soviet borders, including potentially his own. It's not just he who can make claims, because he said that things change and therefore they could claim the Ukrainian border. What if somewhere down things change with China too? And China makes claims on its own territory. Now, for now, Russia clearly thinks it's safe because one thing that's notable during the war is that Russia pulled all of its forces, or a lot of its forces, from the Russian Far East into Ukraine. They've taken troops from all of their borders, showing that they actually think those are the borders that have been fairly secure, including from Finland and the border with Norway, up in the kind of whole Kola Peninsula, and from Central Asia, even including their troops in Tajikistan and the border with Afghanistan, and troops that they'd had in the Far East military district to deploy them to Ukraine. So this is, down the line. But I do think that we should be watching very closely and seeing how this plays out over the longer term. Russia's hoping that obviously it will remain an equal partner with China, but there's a lot of reason to believe that it will be anything but that, particularly at the end of this war in Ukraine.
Yeah, so I think because we already see 11 questions in the
chat.
And
yes, lots of questions. And I'm giving very long answers. I'm sorry.
No. I just want you to wind up maybe before the 45 minutes, and by having two final questional issues from my side. One is that it becomes very obvious at the moment from what you said here and what you have said in interviews, that at the moment it's very difficult, if not impossible, to diffuse military tensions with Russia in the short term. And but I'm reading the American strategy at the moment because you don't want to have this conflict plus a conflict in the Taiwan Strait, a military conflict, where Biden always commits that the United States might even help militarily, not just by providing weapons. That the US strategy should be to diffuse tensions with China as much as it can in order to provide the Chinese to take advantage and go after Taiwan. So do you agree with that's an imperative, that you do almost the utmost thing to diffuse the military tension that could emerge with China? And how do you, because it got a lot of criticism also within the United States by people like Tom Friedman of the New York Times, Speaker Pelosi's visit to Taiwan back in the summer. And the second question is on Russia. I'm sure that Russia watchers in the United States, like yourself, have scenarios. What would come after Putin? Should he be toppled, die, be ill, removed from power one way or the other? Should we look forward to what comes after him, or is this even more scary in your scenarios? And then I rest my case, and then we can open it to the public.
Well, in terms of China, I mean, I think it is incumbent upon us at this particular point in time to try to see what we can do to manage those tensions, because we also do need to have China put some constraints on Putin in terms of not just the destruction in Ukraine, but this whole effort to destabilize the nuclear balance. You know, we see Kim Jong-un in North Korea firing off rockets in the same way that Putin is threatening it because of, trying to, create nuclear blackmail. And I don't think that, China is particularly interested in that in this instance. China obviously is looking to remain as a great strategic player in the Asia-Pacific region, but it can't be particularly interested then in having, kind of a free-for-all on nuclear weapons at this juncture, because if you're Japan or South Korea or any other country that now sees your security under threat, you'll be wondering whether you should be also acquiring a nuclear weapon, because Putin's making it very clear that Ukraine gave up nuclear weapons in return for guarantees of its territorial integrity and security, and now Ukraine is being attacked. And Putin is threatening to use a nuclear weapon on Ukraine. It couldn't be more clear than that. That was what the 1994 Budapest memorandum was about. And here you have Kim Jong-un.
But Ukraine gave up an important tool of deterrence. Ukraine gave up for a contract that is worth nothing.
Correct.
A major tool of deterrence.
And in fact, my colleagues and I in that report that I mentioned in 1993-94 suggest that Ukraine shouldn't give its nuclear weapons up for precisely this reason. And here you have Kim Jong-un, obviously trying to acquire nuclear weapons, already having developed them, trying to get the ballistic missile capability to blackmail obviously for his own survival. But, we're now getting into that range where Putin is behaving in the same way in other states. We have the question about Iran and the future of the Iranian nuclear program. But we're now having a much more dangerous situation than we've had before. We have many more nuclear powers. This isn't the old strategic balance between the Soviet Union and the United States. It was in the 60s and 80s. We're now having, the risk of greater proliferation of nuclear weapons. And again, that's not to China's benefit either, have a more chaotic security situation in the Asia-Pacific region. Then there's also the issues of climate change or the COVID. I mean, China is again shutting down major cities to try to have zero COVID. There are many issues here that food security, Russia's embargo on Black Sea grain, the knock-on effects on global energy security. I mean, I think the world becomes a much more complex and more dangerous place for China as well, not just for the United States and for the West. Maybe China doesn't see that, but I do think that we need to be engaging with China, because China could constrain Putin to some degree. I'm not hopeful that they will, but they could certainly do that. And we do need to start thinking about how we create global mechanisms, the United Nations, and elsewhere, to really contend with these massive challenges. And we have existential challenges for humanity, not just for individual countries at this particular point. And China is not going to be unaffected by them either. Now, on the other issue about what comes after Putin, well, if something happens to Putin in terms of health or natural death, there is a procedure. Mr. Mishustin, the prime minister, will become the caretaker president, and then there'll have to be elections. We've seen Alexei Navalny, the leading opposition figure, recently write an opinion piece in the Washington Post. I don't know if that came up in the German press as well, suggesting that Russia should think about becoming a parliamentary system over the future, to give more checks and balances in the system. But right now, Putin's getting a lot of pressure from the party of war, the people who want to completely destroy Ukraine, some of these same people that have been around there since the early 1990s, who have his age group and his cohort. There are a lot of people pushing Putin to finish off Ukraine, to dismember Ukraine, take it off the map. It's gone, far beyond the things that we were, talking about before Russia invaded in February. So, there is some risk for Putin now from those other hardliners. That's why he's doing what he's doing. That's why he's trying to destroy Ukraine's infrastructure, because they want him to do that. That's why he's mobilized more forces. But that also is, in terms of the mobilization, more forces, making him more unpopular and the system more unpopular. We're seeing hundreds of thousands of people leaving Russia. And so, there is a lot of risk in the system for him now. And 2024 is an important date because Putin is supposed to put himself up for re-election again in the early part of 2024. He's already been in power since 2000. So he's been in power for 24 years, and he's saying he's going to stay till 2036, by which time he'll be in his 80s. There's a debate in the United States, should President Biden be still president in 80? And you notice that Putin used to make fun of Biden's age, and he's stopped doing that because he's presenting himself now at age 70 as the person who's going to be here forever. And so there's going to be a debate in Russia about whether Putin should stay. And if his popularity is diminished because of what's happening in the war, then that becomes much more of a question. And the question then is, is it the hardliners who take over, or is there some scope for reform? And Russian history actually does give us a little optimism, because if you think back to other wars, the Crimean War, for example, when Nicholas I actually died during the Crimean War, his successor, Alexander II, ended the war and became a reformer. And we know at the end of the Cold War, of course, Yeltsin tried reforms, and we had Khrushchev, who replaced Stalin when Stalin died. I mean, after a period of chaos, and actually it was kind of chaotic with Khrushchev in power as well, but Khrushchev also tried to do reforms. And of course, Gorbachev also tried to reform after the heights of the repressive period under Andropov, because there was necessity to do that. So it's not always the case that this could be negative, but under the current circumstances of a really brutal war, I suspect the hardliners are more likely to come to the fore at this particular juncture.
Okay, well, this was a huge privilege to talk to you about these things, and now I share this privilege with everybody who is listening, and 11 people already, I think, post their questions or comments in the chat. So thanks very much, and I hand it over back to Belf.
No, thank you, Martin, and thank you, Will.
Yeah, but we'll stay on, but just.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you so much for your thoughts. And indeed, we have had a lively action in the chat room. And the first question was actually what is going to come after Putin? And you just answered that question. But Edgar and also Ilya, the first two questions, are also concerned about something that we are all very concerned about. And so maybe Ilya, I don't know if you can turn on your mic if you want to ask your question directly to Fiona Hill.
Well, my greetings. My question was about the possibility of possibly freeze somehow this war, the conflict. And I also mentioned that there was, after the beginning of war, in February, there were some peace talks in Istanbul between representatives of Russia and Ukraine, and after the result of these peace talks were the decision to retrieve Russian troops from Kiev region, Chernigov, and I don't know, Sumy Oblast. So yes, is it possible somehow to stop this, possibly make a ceasefire, something like this?
Well, I think, thank you very much for the question, Ilya. I really appreciate you putting that. Yes, I mean, there were attempts, well, there was attempts before the war, the invasion, to head off the conflict, and with Ukrainian and Russians meeting. And then, as you mentioned, and that just after the conflict started in March and April, there were these meetings in Istanbul. Now, this was not a definite agreement, just to be clear. This was a framework for further talks. And I've personally taken part in many of these negotiations, with Nagorno-Karabakh, Chechnya, for example, Moldova, and many other, if you think about Israel and Palestine and Camp David, you know, you can have a lot of these negotiations, they could go all the way through and then they fall apart. And I think that we saw a whole host of factors that meant that this framework for negotiations to look at an agreement didn't go further forward. One of them was Bucha. Then after the retreat of the Russian forces, people saw the atrocities that had been carried out there, and it made it more difficult to have the discussions. And that makes it very difficult now, Ilya, to have discussions, to get a ceasefire, because of all of the brutality. And in fact, the more that Russia bombs Ukraine, the less likely we are to actually have a ceasefire at this point. In fact, there's a lot of research, and I'm sure that Martin has read a lot about this, about what the United States did in Vietnam with bombing. I mean, the bombing campaigns by Germany during World War II, and many other instances where bombing campaigns are shown to actually harden the attitudes of the populations who are being bombed and make them not want to capitulate. And even, you know, if you think back in sieges, you know, back in time when Russia itself and St. Petersburg, Leningrad was under siege by the German, or the Stalingrad, there was always then this resistance and desire not to capitulate to all the brutality. And I think the more that Russia bombs Ukraine, the less like there is to be a ceasefire at this particular point, because the Ukrainians do not want to capitulate. And it's very clear that the Russian Party of War is basically saying we want to destroy Ukraine. So Ukraine wants to fight back. So we've got kind of a vicious circle going here. The other problem is that Vladimir Putin himself doesn't want to compromise. And in March and April, the people who were doing the negotiations would have had to take anything back to the Kremlin, and Putin might not have wanted to compromise. I mean, I saw that happening actually in the United States when I was in the National Intelligence Council. We had to deal with the Russians that, and this is the United States that walked it back, by some of our negotiators in from Washington, D.C. In fact, Secretary Gates and Condoleezza Rice went out to have a negotiation with Russia, you know, about missile defense, and they actually reached an agreement, but some of their colleagues back at home didn't like the agreement they'd reached, and by the time they came back on the plane, they'd removed the agreement. You know, so you often see in these cases that the negotiators can negotiate something and then find that, you know, the people back at home don't agree, that they have a different perspective. So it's very difficult to get any kind of achievement in these very tense and terrible circumstances. And I think in this case, all of the compromises have to be made by Ukraine, because Russia has taken Ukraine's territory. And Putin has to compromise. If Putin basically what he's trying to do right now is destroy Ukraine, threaten everybody else with a nuclear weapon, so that we will give up and agree to recognition of the annexation of Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporizhzhia, Kherson, as well as Crimea. Putin's basically saying that that's the only way that there can be a ceasefire and that there can be an end to this conflict. He's making that very clear. So we're way further on now than we were when things might have been, you know, able to be agreed on in March and April. I mean, there's no agreement by Putin to remove forces. There's just basically a demand that recognize the fact of annexation of territory. So that's why I was saying before that we need constraints on China, and the rest of the international community said this is unacceptable. I think it's possible to have a ceasefire if it's done with the international community, that there's supervision by the United Nations, but then there has to be ironclad guarantees that Russia doesn't keep the territory and that Ukraine isn't attacked again. And there's no trust and belief that that's going to be the case right now. So again, it's not impossible, but it's going to be very, very difficult given where we are right now in the conflict.
Well, thank you very much. We have quite a few more questions, but I would like to use my position to squeeze in one myself, and that is that there's obviously a huge danger not to put pressure on Putin. But there's also possibly a danger to put too much pressure on Putin. It looks to me like the West is not delivering as many weapons, of course, as would be possible technically. Is there a line between putting too much pressure on him and not putting enough pressure on him? Is there a strategy behind what we see on the daily news, that we deliver more or less weapons now, today, tomorrow, next week?
Well, I think you're outlining the problem here. The problem is all one man, right?
Right.
We're now the hostages of Vladimir Putin, and we're constantly trying to figure out what does he think, which is pretty absurd. When you think about it, he made the decision to invade Ukraine, I mean, with a small group of other people, and he's been putting pressure on Ukraine, he's putting pressure on us as well. I mean, he started this war. He did not have to start this war. There is no reason that he needed to start this war. Ukraine wasn't going to end up in NATO. The United States hadn't made any moves against Russia. This is because Putin himself put himself under pressure by, basically thinking that he needed to take Ukrainian territory for the future of Russia, which again is pretty absurd. And this is how World War I started, World War II started. All conflicts in the world start like this, and they never turn out particularly well. So, I mean, we also have to think about the pressure that Putin is putting on us. He's threatening us with nuclear weapons, or he's threatening Ukraine with nuclear weapons. He's cut off grain and all of the food exports. He's putting the rest of the world under pressure by destroying Ukraine as a major grain producer. Ukraine was the number 4 grain producer in the world. Russia's up there as well as Canada and the United States and then other countries. Well, he's creating famine, for the world as well. So there's a question about putting pressure about him on the battlefield or larger pressure. I think, the pressure is to get Russia out of Ukraine. We're not trying to put pressure on Putin. I mean, I think it's wrong when people say, well, then he needs to withdraw from Ukraine. Before the dilemma is that any compromise, what about what he's doing, elsewhere? What about what he's done to create famine in, Somalia and Ethiopia and all of the countries that were dependent on grain from Ukraine for their food and their food security? So I think that even the way that we're framing the question underscores the problem that we have. All is of one man at this point. So when we talk about a fine line, that's because we worry we're dealing with a maniac, that it's going to blow us all up, rather than actually dealing with somebody who's being very cold and calculated in what he's doing here. Putin wants us to just worry about him. He wants everyone to wake up every single day and worry about what is he going to do. He wants to control Ukraine, and he wants to have a very negative impact on all of us as well. We have to reframe this. We have to, think about how we can put this into a different perspective. I'm equally as concerned as you are about this, but that, basically we've got ourselves into a situation where we think that, Vladimir Putin and his whole mindset is the only thing that matters, rather than about, what we want to have out of this as well, and what Ukrainians want to have out of it.
So maximum pressure is then the answer.
Well, I don't think by maximum, I think we have to be sophisticated about it. It has to be diplomatic. It's not just about weapons. So, I think if people think maximum pressure, they then think about, we have to give Ukraine the ability to defend itself. I mean, we don't want to be, there is no threat to Russian territory, although Putin is saying that Ukraine's territory is Russia's territory. We need to have maximum diplomatic pressure. I really want to put the emphasis on diplomacy in the United Nations, and we have to keep working. That's why it gets back to the point with Martin. We have to try to work with China on this, and with India and with other countries. We have to look at those countries that have so far abstained and figure out how we can work with them to, make it very clear that this is dangerous for all of us. This is not just about Ukraine. That this is now basically a globally dangerous conflict.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. I would like to ask Enno to ask his question. He wants us to refocus a little bit more on China and Russia and leave the West aside a bit. Enno, please go ahead.
Thank you, Enno. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you very much. And let me first say that it's very heartening to observe the same measure of level-headedness and straightforwardness in you that made you our hero when you at the time back at the congressional hearings. So thank you very much. And also thank you to Mr. Werner that he already put the spot on what was my concern, to kind of turn the focus a little bit more on China and Russia and not so much the West. I'm a classical sinologist by training, so I'm aware of the historical side and like the Curio Islands and the territorial conflicts that you already named. But I don't have so much knowledge about the present political situation and possible strains between Russia and China that they have more or less regardless of the West.
Yes, I mean, I think that some of those strains are really in some of the issues that Martin already raised. The risks of really Russia finding itself as being very much the secondary power, which, in many respects it already is, right? Economically and militarily. It's been a long time since Russia had any kind of parity with China. And that, for Putin, actually, I think makes it even more imperative that he has success on the ground in Ukraine, no matter how brutal it is, because he has to look like a winner out of this conflict to be able to hold his own with China. And I do think that there's a great concern there behind the scenes about the loss of Russia's military position after this, the great destruction. If Russia really has lost what they're calling now 90,000 irretrievable losses, in other words, people killed as well as casualties, and they've lost so much equipment, then Russia's no longer the big military power that it was. It's proven that it actually looks more like a regional than a global power. Then there's the impact on Russia's economy. Russia's going to be very weak as a result of all of the sanctions and all the Western companies pulling out. Also, all of the sophisticated components for the Russian military as well as for the Russian industry were coming from the West. That's where the West comes in, not coming from China. And so Russia's innovative capacity, its technical capacity, gets really reduced as well. And then it would have to look to China to replace European, German, and other high-tech equipment for the economy for the future. So it becomes more dependent on China. And already, much of Russia's economic growth in the 2000s was the result of China buying a lot of Russian raw materials, even scrap metal, as well as timber and other natural resources. And of course, that's an unequal relationship. China had been making quite a lot of investment in the Russian economy, but not to the extent that Russia really wanted. And then the dependency on China for buying more oil and gas and coal as well. And the way that China is moving ahead so rapidly on new green technologies and becoming, at the forefront of telecommunications. I mean, I don't know how China's going to play out after COVID either, or how, some of these larger global problems are going to impact China. But certainly China looks so far ahead of Russia that there's going to be a lot of anxiety. Russia starts to look then more like, another regional country that's dominated China. And so, at the end of this conflict, when dust settles, if, it does sometime soon, Russia will find itself in a very uncomfortable position for many Russian politicians, and much more dependent on China than it was before.
What about the Belt and Road Initiative? It strikes me that kind of China is trying to build a bridge and roads and also accesses in a lot of along coastal lines from East Asia to Europe, but somehow the Ukrainian war really disrupts that in a lot of senses.
It does. Yeah, and actually, I mean, it's really good you raised this, because I remember now I forgot to mention or respond to Martin's question about that, because Russia's also been uncomfortable that China's bypassed Russia itself in a lot of the Belt and Road initiatives. So most of the train lines Russia was hoping that China would use the Trans-Siberian and BAM railways, which it did not. It's mostly used Kazakh and other Central Asian railways. That it hasn't really used Russian ports. So there wasn't, kind of the Russian Baltic seaports, and Petersburg wasn't getting much of the traffic. China was going straight to Europe. And of course, China's been interested in the Northern Sea route through the Arctic, but obviously not using Russian ports, because Russian ports are more military than they are commercial. And so there's been a lot of anxiety on the part of Russia that Belt and Road has bypassed Russia and not using the Russian larger landmass. And in fact, some tension was interesting because Russia was nervous about China's commercial ambitions, not just interesting to watch us as well. I mean, really, China's goal with the Belt and Road is to get to European markets. So it was Asia, Russia had previously been dominated center on those routes, but potentially elsewhere. And of course, was also competitive with Russia, because Russia had also invested in those regions, but obviously to no major effect. So, I think you're right to point to that the Belt and Road Initiative, all of these facilities, are also a challenge to Russia, not necessarily a benefit.
Okay, transmission is a bit sketchy, but I thank you very much so far. I hope you can hear me.
Yeah, we do seem
yes,
to
I can
have...
hear you, yes.
I don't want to take too much up of the time. So thank you very much. Wonderful answer. Thank you very much.
Yeah, we do seem to have some technical issues here with the line to Fiona. I hope this is going to get better. We have two questions, Fiona.
Yeah, I'm back again. I think I lost everyone for a moment.
Okay, yeah, we can hear you. Maybe the line is better without the picture. I'm not sure. We have two questions concerning a couple of other states. Styles ask about Iran and Korea in a certain way, and Andrea brings in Central European states. Maybe we can collect these two questions. Styles, can you go ahead, please, and ask your question, and then Andrea?
Sure. Just real quick, you maybe addressed this in some ways already, but the Cold War was kind of marked by these proxy wars where on the one side, the USSR was providing smaller countries with weapons to fight these proxy wars. And now we have this situation where Russia is actually drawing supplies and personnel from smaller countries like Iran and North Korea and the Caucasus and things. And I was just curious to what extent that will damage Russia's image of strength around the world, and especially with the other members of the Russian Federation. Thanks.
Yeah, can I actually mention, just answer that quickly, because I think you're spot on. That really has already damaged Russia's standing. It's very evident. As you're pointing out, Russia was always the major military supplier. Now the idea that Russia is actually having to get weapons from Iran and from North Korea really undercuts that. We've just recently seen some pushback in recent meetings between Putin and some of the Central Asian states, for example. There's a video on YouTube about the Tajik leader Rakhmon berating Putin at a meeting recently of Central Asian states. So I think we're already seeing that.
Well, let's ask Andrea, please. Andrea, can you ask your question, please?
Yes, thank you very much. And thank you very much for your insights. Absolutely interesting. My question was about the Central Eastern European states. I wanted to hear your insights, your opinion about these states' role or evolution in their position with regards to the current situation in Ukraine. Mostly thinking about that, well, the states are former members of the Eastern Bloc, and all of them are, well, their current situations, their current strategic culture are very diverse within the same region, namely Central Eastern European states, and I put inside also like the Western Balkans. So as just before the war, there was increasing Chinese presence in the region. I don't see Fiona any longer. I don't know if she hears me. Okay. Yes, just to put it shortly, my question was about how to understand what to expect from these Central East European countries, considering their very diverse strategic culture with regards to the United States, with regards to China, and also with regards to Russia. And when I say diverse, I think about how these countries have a very diverse interests and security concerns. Thank you very much.
Yeah, I think, Andrea, you're right that we can't look at everything as a block anymore. Yeah, I mean, I think, even with, old Western Europe, we see obviously some pretty different approaches to dealing with Russia and China and the United States, based on history. I mean, history really does count here. The history of various relationships. Obviously, Poland extraordinarily focused on pushing back against Russia and Ukraine because it's a clear petition of the Russian Empire and a period of the Soviet Union. Some countries like yes, I'm very sorry about that. It's a problem of being in a hotel room. But I was basically saying that I just agree with Andrea that the problem is really one that there is no uniform view of countries. A lot of it is dictated in many respects by history, long-standing relationships. And I think that, just to put it succinctly, that this is going to be a real challenge in formulating long-term policy toward Russia and China both, on the part of Europe, the European Union, NATO, the United States, the West writ large, because each country has a very different perspective on its relationships, on its relationship based on its history and its set of relations. I don't want to answer too much longer here because I worry that I'm losing the connection. So I don't know if there are other questions there, but I think Andrea, already laid out the problem there, that there's no block and there's no, common view of Central European countries. Mm-hmm.
Thank you. We have a couple more minutes left, and we can hear you much better, Fiona, now that we don't have the image. And so let me go to what is possibly our last question from one of our students from the US. And this now we are turning finally to another topic back home to the US and the concern that Amy has about how to protect US democracy. So away from the conflict, away from China and Russia, and back to the US. Amy, do you want to go ahead, please?
Thank you, Professor Werner. Thank you, Fiona, for your talk. Hopefully my internet is okay also. I wanted to ask about, pertaining to your testimony before Congress about the impeachment hearing, you talked about the harm of partisan rancor. And since then, we've had a second impeachment hearing, and Congress is just wrapping up the January 6th hearings. My question is about, is the US doing enough to protect democracy, but also are they doing enough to combat domestic partisan divisions and foreign influence campaigns?
Oh, thank you very much, Amy. I mean, this is a really good question. And, I think, the problem is really who the they is, isn't it? When in the way you ask the question, because who has responsibility for this? I mean, clearly, President Biden and the current administration have a role to play here. And initially, when he was elected, he did recognize all of these divisions and try to figure out how to address them in some of his initial speeches. In fact, the whole inauguration speech was focused on this kind of question of trying to forge unity. But as we've seen, partisan politics always plays into it. And now we get towards the midterms, and in a week or so in early November in the United States, and everything's focused again on who wins in terms of party politics. And we've seen, in actual fact, some pretty shameful action by in some of the races where some of the Democratic candidates have actually tried to support some of the people who've denied the election on the part of the Republican Party, because they think that if they get election deniers and more radical Republican candidates to run, they'll have a better chance of winning. And they've actually undermined people who in the Republican Party have spoken out against the actions of Donald Trump and what some of the other Republican members of Congress have done. I mean, that's happened in Michigan, for example, with Peter Mayer. It's kind of, to me, quite shocking that people would actually think about doing that. But it gets to the point that you've said about partisan politics. So in actual fact, I think that it's really that it needs to be members of the public, people like myself and other people who are engaged politically but are not partisan. The vast swathe of the American population don't actually belong to a particular political party, but people in think tanks and universities, students, younger people like yourself, speaking out about this, people getting engaged in politics at the local and national level, and lots of the citizens groups and citizens action programs that are really kind of pushing here on trying to hold people account in the democratic context. Of course, a lot is going to really depend on what happens with this January 6th committee. I fear that against the backdrop of the very partisan nature of the midterms, that the conclusions that they've reached will get lost. There's going to have to be a big effort on the part of the members of the committee to go out and talk to people across the country, not just hope that people have been paying attention. But this is a moment where I think grassroots activism and people at all different levels of society have to step up and to speak out on behalf of American democracy. So it's not going to be very easy, but there's no one group that needs to take the sole responsibility. But I think the problem really is at this particular juncture in Congress, in the congressional political parties, and in people saying that they only represent the people who vote for them. We need to find a way in the United States of holding our representatives accountable and accountable for all their constituencies. And again, that can only be done through public participation and pressure, writing to Congress people becoming more active in local and regional politics as well. It's going to be very difficult. And, I think, as you recognize, everybody else has recognized, it's a very turbulent and dangerous time in American politics.
Yes, this is possibly the end of our conversation for today. We do live in very difficult times, and I would like to thank Martin and Fiona for a very interesting conversation. And I would like to use the comment from Enno, and thanks so much for your very lucid and enlightening answers, Fiona. We also saw that the video format has some deficiencies here and there, but we did have quite a few interesting insights tonight. We, of course, hope to see you, Fiona, one day in Heidelberg, but I would like to thank you very much for being with us online tonight, and would like to pass on the word to Barbara.
And my task is to thank everyone for having come, and also to announce that there will be another Encounters event this year at the end of November. So it's usually on the last Tuesday. This time we really wanted Fiona to be there, so so we pushed it a little bit. But now, you know, we end up having you from a hotel room after all. That's another reason why we must get you again, because you are the heroine of many in the room, and I think also who would have liked to see you and have dinner with you and so on and so forth. And I think
I hope that I can come next year in 2023.
Exactly. Yeah. That's right. So we're hoping that this will work out, and I'm inviting everyone to the next Encounters, which will be on November 29th at the same time, and hopefully in cats, right, this time, so that we can welcome whoever is coming then. Thank you very much, Fiona. I've learned a lot today. Not so many beautiful things to think about, more scary things to think about, but also very, very grateful for your presence in digital form. Thank you very much, and thanks to the audience.
My questions as well. I mean, I really appreciated that as well. So it's really great to be able to interact with everyone, and thank you very much.
So thank you very much from the cats, from the HCR, and goodbye.
Thank you.
Fiona.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Bye, everyone. Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.